I'm here with another one-off special live. I had introduced a series called It's Lit. I would check it out if I were you, especially if you're interested in literature, where I talked about science fiction and why science fiction matters in terms of literature. Um, this is kind of a special one. The very first live I ever did on this channel was called The Shakespeare Myth, where I talked about my um, position in regards to Shakespeare. And my basic position in regards to Shakespeare is that William Shakespeare is not the author of the sonnets and the plays that are attributed to him and through which he's credited, that it was someone else. Now, this, of course, it's been quite a while since I did that, excuse me, since I did that live. That was the very first live that I did, and it was the very first um, video, really, that I did. Live and video. You consider a live a video. And I decided, in light of the fact that It's Lit has been launched, and we'll see how far that goes, was to do something a little separate, a little different, and that is to address something that I've specifically looked into. I used to write a blog for Medium.com, and one of my blog pieces was entitled "The Stigma of Print," which is was William Shakespeare a writer? And in that piece, I basically make the argument that William Shakespeare was not a writer. So, if my earlier live, which was called The Shakespeare Myth, looked at Shakespeare from the standpoint of rather holistically as whether he was the author of the plays or not, or the sonnets or not, and examined that. This is a kind of hopefully will be a short live, which where I talk specifically about why Shakespeare wasn't a writer. And so again, my piece is called "The Stigma of Print," and you can find it at com. It's my old blog. My blog is over now. I ended my blog this year. But I guess you can go to medium.com/ at the Doctor 50 to check out the blog if you want to, and the piece. And so in my view, Shakespeare was not a writer. And so a lot of people who are taught in schools and colleges and universities that William Shakespeare wrote 37 plays and and a number of sonnets and poems, and it was considered one of the great writers of English literature, great playwrights within literature in general, globally. Not just He's certainly one of the greatest writers in English literature, but he's also considered one of the greatest writers globally, across the earth. Quite a feat. And so the idea that William Shakespeare was not the author of the plays, or not simply the author of the plays, but not a writer, is something that people may have a hard time with, like I said. And the reason I argue that is pretty straightforwardly. To begin with, actually, the man that is known as Shakespeare was William Shakespeare, and he came from rural country town of Stratford upon Avon. And Shakespeare came from a family, both his father and his mother, his father was a glover, and he at some point became a member of, I think, council in the town. But he came from this kind of modest, very rural, modest family. Both his parents were illiterate, and this Shakespeare's own family, when he got married and had his daughters, had his offspring, they were illiterate. We don't know, really, first and foremost, whether William Shakespeare himself, who is known to the world as Shakespeare, was literate. It's assumed he was literate. And But the first and foremost thing I would say is we really don't know whether he could read or not. The assumption is because of the term William Shakespeare. Because of the term William Shakespeare on the first folio, which is the first collection of plays attributed to Shakespeare. The assumption is that this Shakespeare is really William Shakespeare, was a writer, but we assume it's assumed that because his name is on the first folio that he's a writer, of course. But the first assumption you have to understand is we really don't have any records because we don't know whether this Shakespeare had an education. There was a school in the town of Stratford upon Avon. It was a grammar school, and because Shakespeare's father became a politician, he was entitled to go to that town. Go to that school at some point. But no records exist of the school, so we really have no idea whether this Shakespeare, known to us as Shakespeare, we don't know whether he actually went to a school or not. And this is why I say we don't really know whether, quote unquote, Shakespeare, which is Shakespeare, was literate. We don't know. Because we don't know whether he had an education or not. And so if we don't have any records of this man's education, or whether he had an education or not, and if we don't know whether he could read or not, then we don't really know whether he could be a writer or not. Again, what we have is the name William Shakespeare on the plays, the first folio in the plays and the sonnets, poems, so forth. The second aspect, again, extending the idea, extending education is, to the best knowledge that we have, the records do not show that a William Shakespeare, meaning Shakespeare, went to university. So he didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge or any other university. And he certainly didn't train as a lawyer in the Inns of Court, which were the lawyer training facilities at the time. They still exist, but they have a more modified function these days in the UK. So why do I say this? Well, if we look at the plays of Shakespeare, if we look at what's contained in them, we see a breadth and depth of knowledge about a great many things, one of which is the law. And that's why I mentioned the Inns of Court, because it's very clear that whoever the author of Shakespeare's plays were, they knew a good deal about the law. Not a little about the law, not a modest amount about the law, a great deal about the law. So if they weren't lawyers, if this person who wrote these plays didn't get it wasn't a lawyer, they at least received some training or background in regards to law because they knew a great deal about it. There's also a sort of knowledge of court, meaning the royal court. Now, the best that we know of in regards to Shakespeare, meaning Shakespeare, is that he was supposedly an actor, and I believe a theater manager at one point, but an actor. Again, we start adding these up, and we go with, again, when we look at the plays, I'll take Hamlet for example. Hamlet, of course, has a certain knowledge of royal institutions, of royal courts. The character of Polonius in Hamlet is supposedly based on Lord Burleigh, who was one of the most powerful members of the aristocracy and part of the British ruling class at the time. Now, how is it that in order to know a person like Burleigh and to have the kind of familiarity with aristocratic institutions and aspects, a person would have to have a knowledge of court, of being around people. Now, in an interview for, I believe it was the PBS episode, The Shakespeare Mystery, I believe that's the name of it. If I'm wrong, let me know. A former Minister of Parliament, Enoch Powell, controversial figure. I don't agree with his politics at all. But we do agree in regards to our doubts about Shakespeare being the author of the plays and the poems. And so he went to Stratford and he was talking about Shakespeare. And it was clear to him, as he put it, that whoever wrote the plays had been in, quote, the kitchen. He knew about politics. He knew about government to a certain extent. And Powell himself said this is not something an author can be briefed on, that can receive just some knowledge. This is experiential detail. This is someone who had experience in politics, in government, and to some extent in court. Could someone like William Shakespeare, who came from this modest country town, who was an actor supposedly, could this man have the kind of knowledge that the vast majority of commoners didn't have? And I hate to use the term commoner, but that was the way it is. The commoner aristocrat laity. I mean, distinction. Commoners did not know anything about what went on in court or in aristocratic homes and institutions. They did not, because there was no there was no way for them to mingle. These were separate worlds. These were divided, segregated, bifurcated worlds. There's no way they would have known about this. And there's no way that someone like William Shakespeare or Shakespeare could have known about this either. For him to know about court, he would have had to be an aristocrat. At the very least, he would have had to have been a person of enough stature to be accorded entry into aristocratic homes and aristocratic institutions, royal institutions. Right. I think another aspect when it comes, and so we have the fact that the basic education is unknown to us. We don't have a record of that. We don't know even if this man could read. Extrapolating forward, the will. So let me just add this, even though I'm kind of going over this. The will of Shakespeare had about some well, let me just progress forward. Let me make one last point. The actual man himself, William Shakespeare, supposedly was an actor, went to London, supposedly became a theater manager. And this individual that we know of, coming from this country town, ended up going back to Stratford and ended up owning a few homes, ended up becoming a merchant of, of grain. In fact, he hoarded grains. He hoarded materials, which is what he got into trouble. And he sued individuals, was litigious. So this Shakespeare that we know, supposedly an actor in his past, became quite a tight-fisted and fairly well-to-do merchant. In fact, one could argue that William Shakespeare, the man, is more like Charles Dickens' Scrooge in A Christmas Carol. We're coming up on holiday season, so that makes sense. And Shakespeare seems more like Scrooge, certainly, than anyone else, than this William Shakespeare who supposedly wrote these plays. So when we look at the man himself, something about it doesn't make sense. This this money-hungry merchant wrote all of these great plays with their erudition, and their focus on areas like Italy. A number of the plays are set in Italy, and whoever wrote these plays was familiar with Italy. Just as I mentioned before about the law, whoever wrote these plays knew a great deal about Italy. They didn't know from books. They did, because literacy was not common. They didn't know from anything else because there was no TV, and there sure as hell was no internet. So how did this person, we don't know if Shakespeare left the country. We're not aware of that. So how did this guy have all this knowledge of Italy if we're not aware if he never left England. And to our knowledge, Shakespeare never left England. We don't know whether he did or not. Again, when we look at the man, it doesn't seem like this is a guy who wrote, or this is an individual who wrote these plays and who wrote these sonnets and poems. And so when we get down to it, when we sum it all up, basic education. We don't know whether this guy could even read or write. We don't know if Shakespeare could do it. Right? I mentioned the will, 5 shaky signatures. And of course, in this will, he leaves nothing in terms of anything a writer would use. No books, no papers, no manuscripts, nothing in that regard. So let's go back to this. Basic education. We don't know if he could read or write. We don't know. Because we don't know if he went to school at any point. Advanced education. Didn't go to college or university. Didn't have much education that we're aware of as an adult. And the novels themselves require a great deal of education and erudition, knowledge in areas like the law. And when it comes to the court, this is a guy who clearly had to have some knowledge of court, royal institutions, aristocratic institutions, even politics and government of the time. We don't have any indication that this Shakespeare did. And finally, Shakespeare, the man himself. This money-hungry, tight-fisted businessman. Quite effective, quite as successful. But beyond that, beyond his litigiousness and the fact that he, in his will, left his second best bed to his wife, we don't get much of a writer here. In fact, we don't get anything of a writer in this man. So at the end of the day, when we add this up, and a lot more, it's very clear that William Shakespeare, or should I say William Shakespeare, was clearly not a writer. And he clearly didn't write the plays, poems, and sonnets attributed to him. Thank you for watching.